Shana Tova. It's enough to bring a parent to tears, except that every parent I know ran out a long time ago. I know I did. Ran out of tears, ran out of energy, ran out of patience. Through these grinding 18 months, we've managed our kids' lives as best we could while abandoning our own. It was unsustainable then, and it's unsustainable now. No matter what fresh hell this school year brings, it's still unsustainable. Parents aren't even at a breaking point anymore. We're broken. And yet we'll go on because that's what we do. We sweep up all our pieces and put them back together as best we can. We carry on chipped and leaking and broken because we have no other choice. And we pray that if we can just keep going, our kids will survive too. So writes Chicago-based writer Dan Sinker in The Atlantic a few weeks ago. The New York Times reports almost 1 million mothers have left the workforce, with Black mothers, Hispanic mothers, and single mothers among the hardest hit. Almost 1 in 4 children experienced food insecurity in 2020, which is intimately related to the loss of maternal income. Closer to home, despite every effort we made to support her, our own Jenna Highland recently decided to step away from her position as our membership and program coordinator. She wrote to us, "I am not the first single mom that the pandemic broke, and I sadly won't be the last." This is a sermon for so many of us, not just parents, who are feeling broken. Not just from coronavirus, but from so many things that are broken in our world today. Israel's relationship with the American Jewish community, racism in America, our public discourse, the list is long. I sat down with someone from our community over lunch a few weeks ago and asked this person, "What do you think people need to hear from their rabbis this year?" That it's going to be okay, this person said. I thought about their words for a long time. And even though I'm speaking to most of you through Zoom, over a camera, again this year, I can say those words to you this Rosh Hashanah. We will get through this. It will be okay. The pandemic will end one day. Things will get better, but not right away. Maybe not even very soon. And we need to stop believing and acting as if the pandemic is over or that its end is right around the corner. As the new year begins, I want to suggest a useful term for us to take with us into the year to come: patient faith. Years ago, Rabbi Kalman Kalanimus Shapira offered hope to his community during far worse circumstances. He was a rabbi in the Warsaw Ghetto to Hasidic and secular Jews, scared, suffering days and weeks and months without end. Jews, he wrote, walk around broken in pieces, bent to the ground, filled with the deepest despair and depression. Shapira lived through the Nazi siege of Warsaw, during which 30,000 people were killed, including his only son, daughter-in-law, and sister-in-law. He wrote about how words of consolation had become old and stale, having no effect on the speaker or the audience, but the hope, the faith that he did offer was different than what you might expect from a Hasidic rabbi. It was what I want to call patient faith. He writes, a person needs to hope at every moment to be saved by God, but one must not depend entirely that the outcome will be immediate salvation. If a person sustains himself only with a belief in imminent salvation, it will be difficult to bear when, God forbid, salvation is delayed. When it became clear that the Nazis were about to destroy the ghetto, Shapira took his collected teachings, including the one that I just quoted above, and taking the long view, he gave it to a group of people who buried it with other documents in a milk canister. Shapira was killed in November 1943, but after the war, the milk canister was found by a construction worker, and this Rebbe's words survived, and they were published by his students. Rabbi Shapira's life and teaching were an extraordinary act of patient faith. His life and his Torah from 80 years ago can give us inspiration for 5782. We live in a world of instant news, of tweets and Facebook posts. Rabbi Shapira offers us a different model, a faith that acknowledges the damage done by the need for instant gratification, by making ourselves slaves to the instant. I was walking with April Springer in Jerusalem this summer and asked her about her experience of being a teenager online during Israel's conflict with Hamas in Gaza in May. And she said, everyone wants me to have an answer, to respond, to say something now. I'm still learning. I don't know what I think yet. Can we have patience with each other, patience with ourselves, patience with the Jewish people, patience with the state of Israel? Relationships of depth go through highs and lows. They require patience that gives each party the space to grow and change. Singer and songwriter Ben Platt, who went to Camp Ramah in California when I was the director many years ago, expresses this in a beautiful song. He said, "Who said it's true that the growing only happens on your own? They don't know me and you. I don't think you have to leave if to change is what you need. You can change right next to me. When you're high, I'll take the lows. You can ebb and I can flow. And we'll take it slow and grow as we go." During the Gaza conflict in May, I was in despair, not only because millions of Jews and Palestinians once again feared for their lives, but because within Israel there were the worst Arab Jewish riots in the last 20 years. Israel's relationship with its Arab citizens is, I believe, a crucial test of its ethical treatment and commitment to true democracy and equality for all its citizens. In the moment, I feared Arab-Jewish relations would not recover from the riots for generations. But 2 weeks later, something remarkable happened. For the first time in 50 years, an Arab party, the conservative Islamist party, Ra'am, became a critical part, the linchpin actually, of Israel's current governing coalition. A coalition led by Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who is in many ways more right-leaning than former Prime Minister Netanyahu. For me, it was a lesson in the importance of patience, of not being slave to the instant, a reminder that our relationship with Israel requires patient faith that things can change for the better, even and perhaps especially when such change seems impossible. I started to think about this idea of patient faith when I learned the teaching of Rabbi Shapiro in one of my sessions at the Hartman Institute, but another one of my teachers for this idea came from a rather unexpected source for a sermon on Rosh Hashanah, the conservative Islamist politician named Mansour Abbas. At Hartman, we had a shiur, a learning session with Micha Goodman. Goodman is a public intellectual who used to teach philosophy at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and now is a consultant to Israel's Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and Foreign Minister Yair Lapid. He told us, if you don't know the name Mansour Abbas, you can't understand what is happening in Israel right now. Mansour Abbas is a member of the southern branch of the Muslim Brotherhood and head of Ra'am, a conservative Islamist party that joined Israel's current government. Arab parties have not been part of Israel's governing coalition in 50 years, both because Jewish parties have been suspicious of Arab loyalty to the state, and also because Arab Israelis risked being accused by their brethren of betraying the Palestinian national cause. And Goodman wanted to understand why a conservative Islamist, a deeply religious Muslim Arab, would join the governing coalition. What was the theology that allowed Abbas to take this step? So to understand this, he went to learn with who else but an Orthodox female scholar at Bar Ilan University named Dr. Nessia Rubinstein Shemer, Israel's leading scholar on the Muslim Brotherhood. According to Goodman and according to Rubinstein Shemer, as a deeply religious Muslim, Abbas believes that Allah will, in the end of days, restore Muslim rule over the entire Middle East, including all of Israel, Palestine, not just Gaza and the West Bank. But because Abbas believes so deeply in God's promise, in Allah's promise for the end of days, Abbas feels no obligation to take steps now to make this happen. His job now is to make life better for the people who he represents through better education, through zoning for new homes and neighborhoods and better infrastructure, all things he is now helping to achieve by participating in Israel's government and winning major victories in the budgeting process. Abbas and his party, explained Goodman, are pragmatists not in spite of being Islamists, but because they are Islamists. Abbas does this because, according to Goodman, he makes a categorical distinction between God's promise and God's command. Just because God promises something doesn't mean that we have to do it, that we have to do it. In fact, just the opposite is possible. Precisely because God promises something may mean that we need not, or that we should not, do it ourselves. In Jewish tradition, one of the blessings of the weekday Amidah asks God to restore someone from the line of King David to rule as king over Israel. Why? Because that's part of God's promise for the end of days. Does the fact that these words are part of Jewish liturgy mean that no Jew can believe in democracy? Of course not. A religious mind can be flexible. We can pray for God to fulfill God's promise for the end of days without assuming that because God has promised it, God has therefore commanded us to do it for ourselves. We can have patient faith. Another example, in Genesis 12, God promises the land of Israel to Abraham's descendants. Just 2 verses later, there's a famine. And Abraham leaves the land of Israel and goes to Egypt. Why does he go? Does Abraham leaving somehow not believe God's promise of the land made just 2 verses before? No. Abraham understands that God's promising him the land did not relieve him of responsibility for his life, nor was it somehow a commandment for him to do all of it himself, to stay in the land and conquer it. Jewish tradition teaches that we can believe in God's promises without taking upon ourselves the commandment to fulfill all of them right now. That God's promise that everything will be okay doesn't relieve us of the responsibility for the world, but it invests us with the responsibility to do what we can. We can believe, to use the language of Dr. King, who himself was quoting a 19th century preacher, Theodore Parker, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We can believe in God's promise that the world will, in the end, become more just, while knowing that the moral arc is long and the process may take a long time. I'd like to suggest that this Rosh Hashanah, now more than ever in this moment, we need patient faith. We need a middle point between two extremes of faithless despondency and naive optimism. Between, on the one hand, despair that the world is falling apart and there is nothing that we can do. That sort of despair leads us to passivity and helplessness and allows the darkness and evil, God forbid, to swell and drown out the voices of hope and goodness. And on the other hand, between the naive optimism of silly phrases like God doesn't give us anything that we can't handle, or all we need to do is believe in God and that God has a plan, an optimism that fails to acknowledge the pain people are suffering, the problems that afflict our world, and the responsibility that we have to be God's partner in repairing the world. Patient faith rejects these extremes, charting a middle path, a resilient optimism that doesn't deny the challenges that we face, but also doesn't despair that the problems are too big to overcome, that doesn't tell us it's you are all alone and it's all up to you. As the rabbis taught, Lo alecha hamlacha likmor velo ata ben chorin libatel mimena. It is not your obligation to complete the task, but you're not free to desist from it either. I want to return to the coronavirus pandemic and suggest how patient faith might help us as a society and as individuals to navigate this current moment and the weeks and months and even years to come. In an article in The Atlantic titled, "The Coronavirus is Here Forever. This is how we live with it," the author, Sarah Zhang, writes how a different future may be hard to imagine with intensive care units filling up yet again during this Delta surge, but she writes the pandemic will end. She explains when enough people have gained some immunity through either vaccination or infection, preferably vaccination, the coronavirus will transition to what epidemiologists call endemic. It won't be eliminated, but it won't upend our lives anymore. One way or another, it will end. But she says, how we get there, that's up to us. Letting the virus rip through unvaccinated people may get us to endemicity quickest, but it will also kill the most people along the way. The eventuality of endemic COVID-19 does not mean that we should drop all precautions. The more we can flatten the curve, she writes, now, the less hospitals will be overwhelmed and the more time we can buy to vaccinate the unvaccinated, including our children. Patient faith assures us it will, in the end, be okay. Life is scary and hard right now, but we can and should have faith that the pandemic will end. But patient faith does not absolve us from doing everything that we can in the meantime to save lives. We cannot all at once complete the task. We can't bring it to a quick end, but that fact cannot absolve us from doing everything we can to flatten the curve and save lives, Doing so, and let me say this from the Bima on Rosh Hashanah, is a mitzvah, a divine commandment, an obligation. On February 1st, 2021, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the Conservative Movement unanimously passed a tshuva stating Jews are required to wear, by Jewish law, to wear appropriate face covering, physically distance, wash hands, obey maximum occupancy and attendance restrictions, and follow all other public health measures recommended by public health authorities. And Rabbi David Glinken of the Masortis Schechter Institute in Israel ruled a long time ago and reaffirmed this ruling for the coronavirus. It is a halachic obligation for Jews to vaccinate themselves and their children unless their doctors determine that it's dangerous for that specific person to be vaccinated due to pre-existing condition. And similarly, Jewish law permits a school, a synagogue, anywhere in the world, or the government of the state of Israel to enact a regulation that one must receive a vaccination and to prevent an unvaccinated person from entering a synagogue, a school, or a shopping mall. One distinction between conservative Judaism and Orthodoxy and the Reform and Reconstructionist movements is our movement's continuing insistence on the place of halakha, Jewish law, to guide every aspect of our lives, and the decision whether or not to vaccinate is not, within Jewish law, a choice that is left up to the individual. As our nation is ravaged by yet another surge in coronavirus-related illnesses and deaths, I will state again from the Bima here that Jewish law requires this, absent some sort of exception from a medical doctor. As the new year begins, I want to also apply this lens of patient faith to an important initiative that Bethel is embarking upon this year. We are in the middle of a national reckoning on race. The struggle for a world free of racism began a long time ago. As Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said in Chicago in 1963, at the first ever National Conference on Religion and Race, quote, at the first conference on religion and race, the main participants were Pharaoh and Moses. Moses' words were, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go that they may celebrate a feast to me. While Pharaoh retorted, who is the Lord that I should heed this voice and let Israel go? The outcome of that summit meeting, said Heschel, has not yet come to an end. 58 years later, the outcome of the summit meeting has still not come to an end. In his address, Heschel asserts that the problem of racism exists in two spheres: the public and the private, the realm of social policy and the realm of individual bias and fear and privilege. Good people, good Jews in our community can and will disagree about the best way to address racism in the public sphere. And our synagogue will always remain open to people of different and conflicting political opinions. But our communal inclusion of people with different political approaches does not relieve us of the responsibility to do the soulful work of reflecting on our individual biases and how each of us can contribute to building a more just and equal world. We have congregants, Jews of color. They are our family. They may have a different experience when they see a police officer guarding our doors on the high holidays. Bishop Godby and our friends at the River Church have conversations with their children about what to do when they are pulled over by the police that many of us don't need to have with our children in the same way. Fighting racism cannot depend upon them alone. Patient faith reminds us that America's race problems did not end on the day when Derek Chauvin was convicted, nor will they be solved tomorrow or the next day. But neither does patient faith in God absolve us of our responsibility to do our part. We can't fix America's race problems this year, but we can begin with ourselves. With the help of our Racial Justice Task Force this year, we are undertaking a year of committee and congregation-wide programming focused on racial justice and equity, so that Bethel can be a place for each of us to reflect without being judged, without being accused, to reflect on our own biases and privileges and fears. These difficult conversations will take place under the guidance of experienced facilitators, and I'm grateful to the task force for its thoughtful approach. At a board and leadership retreat a few weeks ago, I participated in one of these conversations. My table was guided by Bethel's former president, Rachel Galanter. We were given time to read and share our reactions to an article that we're going to put in the chat about lessons for 2020 from Rabbi Heschel's 1963 address. And if we don't put it in the chat, we'll send it out to you this week. In one moment, I shared my fear around that table that too often Jewish vulnerability is erased in conversations about white privilege. And I also reflected on how I could play a critical role in reassuring, especially those of you who are most skeptical of this work, about how Jewish it is and why it's important for us for it to take place, Davka especially, in a synagogue. On your beautiful high holiday cards that were part of the kits that were sent, I shared a passage from a book called Ha'ish Moshe, The Man Moses, by Israeli author David Sneh. God gave Moses the Torah, and Moses noticed how fragile it was, writes Sneh, how God whispered to Moses, if something is alive, it has to be breakable. Conversations such as these require us to be breakable. They require the humility and the courage to allow ourselves to break a little, because to do so is to be truly alive. That is the work of this season of tshuva, the courage to admit that we live in a broken world and that we ourselves are broken and in need of repair. Because it is high holidays and because it is Bethel, and to honor and the love and wisdom of our teacher, Rabbi Sager, that's you. I want to conclude with a poem by Yehuda Amichai. From a distance, everything looks like a miracle, but up close, even a miracle doesn't appear so. Even someone who crossed the Red Sea when it split only saw the sweaty back of the one in front of him and the motion of his big legs, and at most a hurried glance to the side. Fish of many colors in a wall of water, like in an aquarium behind walls of glass. Just like patient faith urges us to hold on to hope, but to let go of the need for it to be fulfilled in big sweeping gestures, Amichai too reminds us that miracles do exist, but up close, they're small, ordinary things like the sweaty back of the person in front of us, or the fish with many colors like an aquarium behind walls of glass. We are not where I thought or hoped we would be last year at this time. I miss you. I too am frustrated and tired and afraid, and I wish you that I could tell you tomorrow it'll all be better. Or next day, or the day after that, but I can't. But I also haven't lost hope. I have faith that things will get better. And I hope that you can have that faith too. Not by ignoring the trouble that our world faces, but by doing ordinary things. Doing ordinary things that we can while letting go of our need for change to come quickly. My patient faith is sustained by the extraordinary love that pulses through our community. I'm a very lucky person. My position is hard sometimes, but I'm blessed because I see not all of you, but many of you and your countless acts of love and kindness done not for honor or adulation, but out of faith. Faith in God, or just faith that it's better to do for another person than just to do for yourself. You can do these things for no reason whatsoever, and in doing so, you keep a candle burning that was lit long ago. May God bless us in the new year with patient faith to believe that healing and justice will win out, and to act as God's partners with the courage and determination needed to make it so. Shana Tova.